Montana Territory, November 1878. The Yellowstone River Valley. The wind came down from the Beartooth Range the way it always did in November. Not as a gust, but as a wall. A cold, indifferent, grinding pressure that pushed against cabin doors and found every gap between logs, every crack and chinking, every poorly sealed window frame. Temperatures in the valley floor regularly dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius before Christmas. And the settlers who had staked their claims along the river bends knew, with a certainty carved into their bones, that the difference between a well-built hearth and a poorly built one was not a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. That November, a German-born stonemason named Eric Wendler broke ground on something the valley had never seen. He was not young, 43 years old, with hands that looked like river stone themselves, scarred from 2 decades of quarrying limestone in Württemberg before emigrating to the United States in 1861. He had built chimneys in Pennsylvania, fireplaces in Missouri, stone foundations in Kansas. He had seen fire behave in more ways than most men could name. And what he was digging, on the south-facing slope of his claim, looked nothing like a chimney. It looked like a grave. A long, narrow trench, 40 feet from end to end, cut into the frozen earth at a gentle upward angle, lined with flat sandstone slabs hauled by mule from a shelf outcropping half a mile east. The settlers who passed on the wagon road above squinted down at the man digging in the cold and shook their heads. A few stopped. Most didn't bother. The most respected builder in the entire Yellowstone corridor, a contractor named Amos Krill, who had erected the timber frame of the new general store in Billings and whose opinion carried the weight of a loaded freight wagon, rode past one afternoon and reined his horse to a stop. He looked at the trench for a long moment. "That," he said, loud enough for 3 bystanders to hear, "is a burial pit for fire. That man is going to freeze to death in his own home and wonder why." He rode on. Eric Wendler did not look up from his work. If you've ever wondered why the frontier cabins that survived the worst winters weren't always the biggest or the most expensive, stay with me. Because what this man was building in 1878 would, within 3 winters, quietly change the way people thought about heat, stone, and the ground beneath their feet. If this kind of forgotten engineering is your thing, hit subscribe. Every week we dig up one technique that worked when lives depended on it. Hit the bell, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because the answers always surprise me. To understand what Eric Wendler was doing and why it infuriated people, you have to understand what everyone else was doing. The standard frontier fireplace of the 1870s American West was a direct draft hearth, a firebox built into or against a wall, connected to a vertical stone or clay mortared chimney that rose straight up through the roof. It was fast to build, simple to maintain, and almost universally inefficient. Estimates from period accounts suggest that a conventional open hearth fireplace of this type transferred somewhere between 10 and 20% of its generated heat into the living space. The remaining 80 to 90%, the vast majority of the energy locked in every cord of split pine and fir, went straight up the flue and out into the Montana sky. For a settler burning between 4 and 6 cords of wood through a single hard winter, that was an enormous cost in labor, time, and physical risk. But there was a second problem, one specific to the terrain of the Yellowstone Valley. Wendler's claim sat in what local homesteaders called a wind run, a natural corridor between 2 ridge lines that funneled cold air from the northwest at sustained speeds that could hold 30 miles per hour for days at a time. In that kind of wind, a standard vertical chimney behaved unpredictably. Downdrafts, caused by wind pressure at the top of the flue exceeding the draft pressure generated by the fire below, were common. Smoke reversed course, billowed back into the cabin, and turned the interior into something between a smokehouse and a slow-motion disaster. Oral accounts from homesteaders in similar terrain describe families sleeping on the floor in winter with wet rags over their faces or keeping fires deliberately small to reduce backdrafting, which in turn kept the cabin dangerously cold. Eric Wendler had spent the first winter on his claim in exactly these conditions. He had arrived in the valley in the spring of 1877 with the intention of building carefully and correctly. He had mortared a conventional hearth into the north wall. the wall he believed would form the best thermal barrier against the prevailing wind. By January of 1878, he had burned through nearly all of his wood reserve, and the cabin interior rarely rose above 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 5.5 degrees Celsius during the coldest nights. His water bucket froze solid before morning on multiple occasions. The backdraft from a northwest gust was so severe during one week-long storm that he could not maintain a fire at all for nearly 36 consecutive hours. He sat in that cold cabin with a candle and a piece of paper and thought for a very long time. The problem was not the fire. The fire was fine. The problem was the geometry, the straight vertical path that let heat escape and let wind dictate terms. If the hot gases from the fire had to travel a longer, more complex path before exiting the structure, they would release more of their heat before leaving. And if that path ran through the ground, through dense, thermally massive sandstone, the stone itself would absorb heat during the burn and radiate it slowly back into the living space for hours afterward, long after the fire had died. He had seen something similar, though far less refined, described in a German technical pamphlet about the hypocaust, the underfloor heating systems used in Roman bathhouses, that he had read as an apprentice stonemason in Stuttgart. He had no access to that pamphlet now, but the principle lived in his memory with the clarity of something learned young. The solution was already in the ground. He just had to build a path for it. Here is what Eric Windler built, described plainly the way a man might describe a photograph. The firebox itself was not inside the cabin. It was built at the base of the south-facing slope, roughly 15 feet downhill from the cabin's foundation. A low, stone-arched combustion chamber, approximately 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall, built from dry-stacked limestone with a clay-mortared interior surface. The firebox had a small iron door he had traded for at a hardware store in Billings, and it sat partially below grade, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides by the earthen slope itself. From the back of the firebox, a flue channel, roughly 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, lined on all sides with flat sandstone slabs, ran underground at a slight upward angle for 40 feet, passing directly beneath the cabin's stone foundation before emerging through the floor in the northeast corner of the single-room structure. At the point of emergence inside the cabin, the channel widened into a low, broad stone platform, what Windler called, in his own notes, a warm socle, a heat pedestal, roughly 4 feet square and 18 inches high, built from the same sandstone, mortared solid, and topped with a flat capstone. From there, a short conventional chimney section rose 8 feet to a roof exit. The thermal logic was straightforward, even if the construction was not. Hot combustion gases, which can exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 538 degrees Celsius, at the point of generation in a well-fed fire, were forced to travel 40 feet through a stone-lined underground channel before they could exit the structure. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.92 kJ/kg degrees C, meaning it absorbs and holds thermal energy exceptionally well. The 40 feet of channel, combined with the massive stone platform inside the cabin, represented somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of thermally active stone. During a 2 to 3 hour burn, that stone absorbed an enormous quantity of heat. When the fire died, the stone continued to radiate warmth into the cabin interior for 6 to 10 hours, depending on outdoor conditions, at a slow, steady, even temperature. The firebox being located outside and below grade solved the backdraft problem almost entirely. Wind pressure at the rooftop flue exit could no longer reverse the draft, because the underground channel created what engineers now call a thermal siphon effect. The column of hot gas in the underground section maintained a natural upward draw that wind at the chimney cap could not easily overcome. There was one more detail that particularly irritated Amos Krill and every other builder who heard about it. There was no visible chimney on the front or sides of the cabin. The only exterior evidence of the system was the low, half-buried firebox door on the south slope, and the short stub of chimney rising from the roof's northeast corner. From the road, the cabin looked like it had almost no heating system at all. To a man like Krill, whose reputation was built on the visual authority of a well-proportioned stone chimney rising above a roofline, This was not just unorthodox. It was an insult to the craft. No stack, Krill reportedly told a group of men at the hardware store that winter. No draft, no front hearth, no heat, just a hole in the ground and a man who read too many form books. The room, by all accounts, laughed. The hardware merchant, a man named Rufus Pierce, had already refused to extend Windler credit for the lime mortar he needed to complete the interior platform, calling the project unbuildable nonsense and unwilling to risk supplies on what he assumed would fail within a season. Windler finished the mortar work with a local clay mix and river sand. He lit the first fire in late October of 1878, alone, in the dark, with the wind making its usual noise against the hillside. He pressed his palm flat against the stone platform and waited. Within 90 minutes, the stone was warm to the touch. He said nothing to anyone. Word travels fast in a small valley, especially when it travels as mockery. By early December of 1878, most of the settlers within a 5-mile radius of Windler's claim had heard some version of the story. The old German stonemason who had buried his chimney underground like a man hiding something embarrassing, who had no proper hearth to speak of, whose cabin looked cold from the outside because, as Rufus Pierce put it, it probably was. The criticism came in waves, and it came from different directions. The first wave was practical. Other homesteaders, men who had built conventional fireplaces themselves and taken reasonable pride in the work, pointed out the obvious risks. A buried flue channel was a maintenance nightmare. If the mortar cracked under the freeze-thaw cycle, the crack would be invisible and inaccessible. Combustion gases could leak into the subsoil. In the worst case, they could seep upward through gaps in the cabin floor, a slow, invisible suffocation risk that no one would notice until it was too late. One neighbor, a taciturn Norwegian farmer named Bjorn Halvard, who had built 3 cabins in the Dakota Territory before moving west, walked the length of the trench before it was backfilled and delivered his verdict in 4 words: rot, fire, gas, fool. The second wave was aesthetic and social. Frontier cabins were judged, in part, by their hearths. A well-built interior fireplace with a proper stone surround and a clean mantel was a sign of permanence, of seriousness, of a man who intended to stay. It communicated to visitors and to potential wives, business partners, and neighbors that the inhabitant was not merely camping but building. Windler's interior, by contrast, featured no hearth at all in the conventional sense. Just a broad, low stone platform in the corner, like a step or a bench, with a short pipe disappearing into the ceiling. Several visitors reportedly asked if the cabin was finished. The third wave was the one that stung hardest because it came with the weight of professional authority. Amos Krill, by this point, had elevated his initial dismissal into something approaching a public campaign. At the Billings Trading Post, which served as the de facto community gathering point for news, opinion, and argument, he made his position clear to anyone who would listen. He had 22 years of building experience in 4 territories. He had built chimneys that were still standing. He understood draft, combustion, and the behavior of heat in stone. And what Windler had built, in his considered professional opinion, was going to fail in one of 3 ways. The underground channel would fill with creosote and catch fire. The freeze-thaw cycle would fracture the flue lining within 2 winters, or the inadequate draft from the short rooftop chimney would result in chronic backdrafting and a smoke-filled interior. Any one of those 3 things, Krill said, at some point that winter, according to an account recorded years later in a local newspaper retrospective, and that man will be rebuilding from scratch in the spring. I've seen this kind of foreign cleverness before. It doesn't survive a Montana winter. What made Krill's opposition more than mere rivalry was the fact that he was not wrong about the risks. Each of the failure modes he described was real. Underground flue channels could and did accumulate creosote. Freeze-thaw cycling was genuinely destructive to mortared stonework. Short chimney runs could produce inadequate draft. What Krill had not accounted for, and what Eric Windler had, was the design details that addressed each of those risks directly. The channel slope ensured condensate drained toward the firebox, not into the cabin. The sandstone lining, laid with intentional thermal expansion gaps at 6-foot intervals, accommodated seasonal movement without fracturing. In the external firebox location, below grade and sheltered from the prevailing wind, generated a consistent, sustained combustion temperature that produced less creosote than a cold-start interior fireplace ever could. The cabin was warm. Quietly, stubbornly, without announcement, warm. But nobody was measuring yet. That would come in January. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that January storm is the one that ended the argument permanently. The blizzard that struck the Yellowstone Valley in the third week of January, 1879, was not unusual by Montana standards in its temperature. Lows reached -22 degrees Fahrenheit, -30 degrees Celsius at the valley floor, but it was exceptional in its duration. 17 days of continuous snowfall and wind. Sustained northwest gusts between 25 and 40 miles per hour. Drifts against the north faces of cabins that reached the roofline. The settlers along the river bends had been through hard winters before. Most were adequately provisioned. But the combination of duration and wind created conditions that exposed every weakness in conventional frontier heating designed simultaneously. Backdrafting became epidemic. The sustained northwest wind at 40 miles per hour created enough pressure at the tops of vertical chimney stacks to intermittently reverse the draft in dozens of cabins up and down the valley. Fires were kept small to reduce the risk, which meant the interior temperatures of many cabins dropped into the high 30s and low 40s Fahrenheit, 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, during the worst nights. Families slept fully clothed, piled together, burning furniture when the wood supply ran short. Wood supply was the second crisis. Several settlers had stacked their cordwood on the north side of their structures for ease of access, not anticipating that 17 days of drifting would bury it under 4 feet of packed snow. Wet wood that had absorbed moisture from poorly covered stacks or ground contact, burned cold, produced excessive smoke, and generated far less heat per pound than dry, seasoned fuel. Cabins that had seemed adequately stocked in November found themselves short by the storm's second week. 2 families in the eastern portion of the valley reportedly burned fence rails and then interior furniture, chairs, a table, a door frame, to maintain survivable temperatures during the storm's final days. The Halvard cabin, belonging to the same Norwegian farmer who had pronounced Wendler's project rot, fire, gas, fool, lost its fire entirely on the 14th day when a sustained downdraft pushed smoke so violently back into the room that the family had to open the door and windows in -18 Fahrenheit weather to clear the air before anyone could breathe. Bjorn Halvard repaired the draft issue with a jury-rigged wind cap fashioned from a tin bucket, but the repair held imperfectly and the fire was small and unreliable for the storm's remainder. On day 9 of the blizzard, a neighbor, a young rancher named Cal Merton, whose claim sat 3/4 of a mile south of Wendler's, pushed through the drifts on foot to ask if he could warm himself at Wendler's fire. He had expected to find the old German in the same condition as everyone else. He found the door, knocked ice from the frame, pushed it open. The air inside the cabin hit him like stepping into a different season. Wendler was sitting at his table, eating a bowl of something hot. There was no visible fire. No flames, no glow, no burning smell. Just the low stone platform in the corner, radiating heat into the room like a warm stone pulled from a campfire and set indoors. Merton stood in the doorway for a moment, not entirely comprehending what he was seeing. He pulled off his gloves. He pressed his bare hands against the stone platform. It was warm, not scorching warm. The slow, deep, even warmth of a thing that had been absorbing heat for days and was releasing it at its own pace, indifferent to the storm outside, indifferent to the wind, indifferent to everything. "When did you last light the fire?" Merton asked. "This morning," Wendler said. "For about 2 hours." Merton looked at him. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, Wendler confirmed. The interior temperature, as recorded by a small alcohol thermometer Wendler kept on the wall, one of the few instruments he had brought from Pennsylvania, read 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 17.8 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was -19 degrees Fahrenheit, -28 degrees Celsius. The differential was 83 degrees Fahrenheit. On 2 hours of fire, That number, 64 degrees inside, minus 19 outside, 2 hours of fuel, is what ended Amos Krill's argument. Not a debate, not a confrontation, just a thermometer on a wall and a man who hadn't burned a stick of furniture to stay alive. Hit subscribe if you want to see what happened next, because the part where the valley starts copying Wendler's system, chimney by chimney, is even better than you'd think. Chapter 6 is coming up. Cal Merton did not leave that afternoon. He stayed for 3 hours, sitting close to the stone platform with his boots off, letting the warmth work its way back into his feet. He and Wendler said little. The old stonemason was not a talkative man, but before Merton left, he pulled a small notebook from his coat and asked 2 questions. How much wood had Wendler burned since the storm began? And how warm had the cabin stayed on the coldest nights? Wendler answered without hesitation, because he had been keeping records. Since the blizzard's first day, 9 days prior, he had burned a total of 18 hours of fire. Not 18 days, 18 hours, distributed across 9 mornings, roughly 2 hours each, using split pine and fir from a covered stack on the east side of the firebox entry, protected from drifting by the slope itself. His wood consumption for those 9 days amounted to just under a third of a cord, approximately 40 cubic feet of split fuel. His interior temperature, logged twice daily with the alcohol thermometer, had not dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit 14.4 degrees Celsius at any point during the storm. On the 3 coldest nights, when the outdoor temperature held between minus 18 and minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 to minus 30 degrees Celsius, the cabin floor level temperature at midnight, the coldest reading of the day, had registered 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, and 63 degrees Fahrenheit respectively. Merton stared at the numbers for a long moment. He knew, because he had been living it, what those same 9 days had looked like in his own cabin. He had burned fire continuously, meaning he had kept wood on the hearth for the better part of every 24-hour period, and had still watched his interior temperature drop to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3.3 degrees Celsius on the worst night. He had consumed, by his own rough estimate, nearly 2 full cords in those 9 days. His woodpile was more than half gone. Wendler's was barely touched. The comparison, written out plainly, was this. Merton's conventional direct draft fireplace, burning nearly continuously, had maintained a nighttime low of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wendler's underground channel system, burning 2 hours each morning, had maintained a nighttime low of 59 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature difference between the 2 cabins on the coldest nights was approximately 21 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel difference was staggering. Merton had burned roughly 6 times as much wood to achieve an inferior result. There was a physical explanation for every digit of that gap, and it came down to one concept: thermal mass retention. When Wendler's sandstone channel absorbed heat during a 2-hour burn, it was storing energy in the molecular structure of the stone itself, the way a cast iron skillet holds heat long after the burner is turned off, but on a scale of thousands of pounds rather than a few ounces. The approximately 3,200 pounds of sandstone in the underground channel and interior platform had a heat storage capacity sufficient to absorb the equivalent of a sustained 2-hour fire and release it slowly and evenly over the following 10 to 14 hours. The release rate was not dramatic. No visible flame, no crackling, no radiant glow, but it was consistent, reliable, and indifferent to what the wind was doing outside. A conventional open hearth fireplace, by contrast, stores almost no heat in its structure. The firebox walls are relatively thin, the thermal mass is minimal, and the direct draft pulls hot gases out of the structure so rapidly that the stone barely warms before the fire dies. The moment the fire is extinguished, the heating stops. In a wind corridor like Wendler's Valley, where drafts ran hard through the night, the effective heating window of a conventional hearth was measured in minutes, not hours. There was one additional data point that Merton noted before he left, and it was the one he would repeat to every person he spoke to for the rest of the winter. He had been in the cabin for 3 hours. The fire had been out for at least 6 before he arrived. The stone platform, when he pressed his palm flat against it as he stood to leave, was still warm. Not faintly warm, Not residually warm in the way a sun-warmed rock feels at dusk. Warm. Deliberately, steadily, persistently warm. Like it hadn't decided to stop yet, he would later say, according to an account preserved in a local newspaper column from 1883. He tucked his notebook into his coat, pulled his gloves on, and walked back into the blizzard. The storm broke on the 20th of January. In the days that followed, as families dug out, assessed their wood supplies, repaired their wind caps and draft covers, and visited neighbors they hadn't seen in over 2 weeks, the conversation in the valley had new shape. People were asking a question they hadn't thought to ask before the blizzard. Not just did you survive, but how much wood did you burn? And when the answers came back, the numbers told a story that was hard to argue with. The average cabin in the valley with a conventional direct draft fireplace had consumed between 1.5 and 2.5 cords of wood during the 17-day storm. 3 families had burned through their entire reserves and resorted to burning furniture, fence rails, or stacked lumber. One family, the Halvards, had spent 4 days with a compromised draft and intermittent fire, surviving on body heat and share blankets. Windler had burned 1/3 of a cord. Cal Merton spread the numbers himself, not with any intention of promoting Windler's design specifically, but because he was a practical man who had stared at a thermometer and a woodpile and understood what he was looking at. He told the story at the trading post in Billings. He told it to Bjorn Halvard, who listened in the particular silence of a man reassessing a previous judgment. He told it to a young homesteader named Silas Drummond, who had arrived in the valley that fall and was already planning his permanent cabin for the following spring. By February, Silas Drummond had walked the length of Windler's underground channel trench, now snow-covered and invisible, and spent 2 long afternoons inside the cabin asking questions. He was not a stonemason. He was a former carpenter from Ohio with no particular experience in stonework. But Windler, who was not a war man in the social sense, was nevertheless patient with a serious question. He drew diagrams in the margin of his logbook. He explained the slope angle, roughly 1 inch of rise per foot of run, enough to ensure drainage toward the firebox without reducing the thermal efficiency of the channel. He explained the stone selection, flat-grained sandstone preferred over limestone for the interior channel walls, because sandstone's layered structure resisted thermal cracking better under repeated heat cycling. He explained the expansion gaps, thin layers of dry sand between every 6 stone cores, allowing the channel to breathe through freeze-thaw without fracturing the mortar. Drummond built his cabin the following spring with a modified version of the system, 26 feet of channel instead of 40, adapted to a flatter building site with a smaller interior platform. The modifications reduced the thermal storage mass by roughly 1/3, which in turn reduced the heat retention time from Windler's 10 to 14 hours down to approximately 6 to 8. It was less efficient than the original. It was still dramatically more efficient than a conventional hearth. The spring of 1880 brought 3 more inquiries. 2 from homesteaders who had spent the previous 2 winters near their limits and were willing to do the extra labor. 1 from a rancher who had heard about the system from Drummond and rode 40 miles to ask about it. By the winter of 1881, local oral accounts and a brief mention in the Yellowstone Valley Courier, a short-lived regional newspaper, indicate that at least 14 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some variation of Windler's underground channel principle. Not all were 40 feet. Not all used sandstone. Several used local limestone, or a combination of fieldstone and clay lining that approximated the thermal storage properties of the original. The results varied accordingly, but in every documented case, the owners reported significant reductions in wood consumption and more stable overnight temperatures compared to their previous conventional hearths. Amos Krill never formally acknowledged the system, but in the spring of 1882, a builder working on a ranch commission in the valley noticed that the stone foundation Krill had spec'd for the new bunkhouse included an unusual feature: a low, broad internal platform in the northeast corner, connected by a subsurface channel to an external firebox location on the sheltered south face. He asked Krill what it was. Krill told him it was a heat distribution feature and moved on to the next drawing. The builder, who had heard the story of Eric Windler's trench, did not press the question. He noted it in his own records, quietly, and said nothing. Eric Wendler died in the spring of 1891, at 66 years old, on the same claim where he had dug his trench 13 years earlier. By then, the cabin had been through 12 Montana winters. The underground channel had been cleaned twice, a half-day's work with a long-handled brush and a lantern, exactly as Wendler had planned for from the beginning. The sandstone lining had developed two minor cracks, both in predictable locations at channel joints, both repaired in a single afternoon with a fresh clay sand mortar mix. The interior platform had not shifted by a measurable amount. The short rooftop chimney had been remortared once. The system had outlasted every conventional fireplace built the same year in the same valley. What Wendler understood, and what Amos Krill, Rufus Pierce, and Bjorn Halvard did not, at least not at first, was something that no amount of building experience automatically teaches, because it requires thinking about heat not as an event but as a substance, not as fire, but as energy stored in matter, released over time, governed by mass and geometry rather than flame and draft. The frontier hearth was designed around the experience of fire, the visible, immediate, emotionally reassuring presence of flame. It worked after a fashion. It kept people alive, but it was optimized for the moment of burning, not for the hours that followed. It treated heat as something to be generated continuously rather than something to be stored and metered. In a landscape where wood was finite, labor was expensive, and the cold lasted 5 months, that was a costly design philosophy. Wendler's system was built around a different question. Not how do I make more fire, but how do I make the fire I already have last longer? It is, when you examine it, the same question that Roman engineers asked when they built the hypocaust beneath the floors of bath complexes 2,000 years before the Yellowstone Valley existed as a name on any map. The same question that Korean builders answered with the ondal, a system of underfloor stone channels heated by kitchen fires that has been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. The same question that Scandinavian stonemasons answered with the kakelugn, the massive soapstone stove designed to burn intensely for a short period and radiate heat for the following 20 hours. None of these systems were primitive. None of them were the product of ignorance or accident. They were the product of careful observation, accumulated knowledge, and the kind of engineering that emerges when the cost of failure is not inconvenience but death. What we tend to call old-fashioned heating is, in most cases, simply heating that was optimized for a world without cheap, abundant on-demand fuel. In that world, the constraint was not technology. The constraint was wood, stone, and time, and the engineers who worked within those constraints produced solutions of remarkable sophistication. The 40-foot trench that Amos Krill called a burial pit for fire is, by the thermal physics that govern every building on Earth today, a passive radiant heat storage system. The sandstone channel is a thermal battery. The short burn cycle is load management. The interior platform is a radiant floor heating element. We use all of these principles in modern architecture. We just use different materials, different names, and different fuel sources to power them. The man who dug the trench in frozen Montana soil in November of 1878, alone, in the dark, with the wind coming down off the Beartooth Range. He wasn't behind his time. He was in the ways that mattered most, exactly on time. That's the story of Eric Wendler's underground chimney. And the thing I keep coming back to is this. The knowledge was always there. In Roman bathhouses, in Korean floor systems, in German technical pamphlets that one stonemason read as an apprentice and never forgot. It just needed the right problem and the right winter to make itself visible again. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to survive? I read every single one. If this kind of history is your thing, the kind where someone digs a hole that everybody laughs at and the hole turns out to be right, hit subscribe. We do this every week. A real technique, a real winter, a real test. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.